Hello, everyone. It's Cameron with the Contrarian Podcast. I am joined again today by Courtland. Courtland, how are you doing?
Good, good. I'm just kind of like thinking of our pregame. Pregame. Well, I guess it's not a game; it's a podcast. But just like the banter and just realizing there's plenty of topics that that we could talk about. So
Yeah. we- Uh, so you guys that are listening, you did missed literally a 30 minutes of conversation before this where we talked about the Crusades. We talked about some European history, and we talked a little bit about the Arch of Titus, which is the previous episode of this podcast. But yeah, Courtland, what have you been up to this week?
this week, I've primarily been working on a few stories of mine. One's kind of, I guess, kind of an action fantasy, just kind of set up, and kind of a mad, not necessarily Mad Max style. Like when you say Mad Max style, that usually kind of means, Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know,
Well,
it, it's a bit
you
more post-apocalyptic, to use the trope term.
and you've told me it's based off of the conventions used in Colin Woodard's American Nations, correct?
Yes, yes, the kind of the American region. So like there's a Yankee nation, there's a Southern nation, there's an Appalachian folks and Western folks, and you throw that in and you just throw in some assassins and oh, there you go, you got a story.
Absolutely. I've been reading some of Cortland's writings. Cortland is very talented in many ways, and I really hope you one day get to publish this so people can
You know,
read it.
right, right. Well, the artist task is to finish, so I'm just hoping for that process to come together, and it's been fun though. I think it's just like I'm a big believer in not art for art's sake, but just art's good for you. It's like I think it's in some ways it's almost even an act of worship.
Yeah,
You
I
know,
mean, it really expresses what's going on inside of you to an outside, more physical medium. So,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly. So,
art for art's sake is not exactly a thing, but that's primary the purpose of art is what people can really understand what the artist is going through, kind of interpreting the artist's meaning of that creation more than just the art itself. I mean, you can appreciate
right.
good art, but
Oh yeah, yeah. Of course. I think like even like the first like Chesterton's argument of the everlasting man is that the first evidences we really have of man is the art. Those the cave paintings and just the gorgeousness of of those images. And it like you take away the artistic theory, it's like oh they drew what they saw, or maybe they drew what they desired, and it's like that's a beautiful thing. So I'm always glad to do that. That's mostly kind of what I've been up to. I've just been kind of taking it easy this week, but I'll kind of amp it up this coming week after Sabbath.
right on. Same here. Looking forward to it. I have been mostly just podcasting. Yesterday we were in the middle of a heat wave, and I pretty much think I slept the entire day. Like I woke up, and then it was just so hot, and I was up for a couple hours, and then I just went back to sleep through the hottest part of the day. Get towards that evening, right?
Right. Well, the heat wave broke here. Like we got monsoon, so I'm hoping that'll go your way.
Yeah, I mean we do get the monsoon, and that's at least some relief. But boy, it's rough. Today we're going to be talking particularly about a subject which is it's really important, I think, to have conversations about, and we're going to be talking about contextualization versus commandments. And I'm just going to pull up Bible app, my eSword app here, and we're just going to, of course, go to Matthew, 28, where we can start about with any sort of talk on evangelism. And it's, of course, go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, all the ethnos, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So, of course, I want to start out with just talking about what it looks like, because you and I are both part of a evangelical fellowship. It's our desire to see people get saved. And of course, the methods and methodology that we use it's a cross-cultural it's crossing cultures in a lot of ways.
Hmm.
The campus has many different cultures, and in a lot of ways, we want to see every corner of campus reached, and a lot of that, as we saw through a lot of the early churches, as a guide. What is it? Thomas went to India, and others went to other places. What is it? Philip ends up talking to an Ethiopian.
I
That
think it's Matthew.
Matthew ends up talking to Ethiopian and goes possibly to Ethiopia. These these early disciples spread across a lot of the Pax Romana and a lot of the world, and even just a simple study of Christian missions is a view of people crossing culture and telling people in different parts of the world about it.
Hmm.
And of course, we've been talking on this podcast about what it looks like to cross cultures and contextualization. And this is something you told me a bit ago, Courtland. You told me the G.K. Chesterton quote, break the convention but keep the commandments. And obviously, I'm a person that is going to be more on the side of keeping commandments over contextualization, because I've seen that in a lot of times when you contextualize, and what I mean by contextualize is it's essentially doing something in a way that is going to be able to really hit well with the culture.
Right.
Uh, a movie not that this movie is true, but it's a movie that both you and I love is the movie Silence,
Mhm.
by Martin L. Scorcho. Uh, but one of the most impactful parts of that movie was this Japanese sort of emissary who could speak Portuguese, and he's like, "You didn't even learn the language. You didn't even do all these things." And it's sort of this view of how contextualization would have worked. But then there's also the reverse side of that when Liam Neeson, Father Ferrero, tells him that they don't even understand what you're saying when they're saying that the sun rises. They think that it's like the actual sun.
Right, right.
So
Amaterasu.
yeah, Amaterasu, exactly. So in a lot of ways, the gospel can get perverted either way, right? It can get messed up in translation, or it can get messed up on the reverse side, and that can become idolatry. So, what do you say in terms of contextualization? What's good for making what's a good way to go about it? Particularly,
Right.
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Well, I think like my favorite thing about the first to explain the quote, this is actually from Chesterton's book, which kind of marriage is the subject, which is break the conventions, keep the commandments. It's one of my favorite quotes because I think it describes what not necessarily what we're all supposed to do, but I think it's more of a describing of a process when people are coming together. I think that's the inherent heart of it, and that's inherently with contextualization. It's a big word, right? I mean, it is really a big word. I mean, if we want to be very simple, it really is just spreading the gospel in a cultural, in a way, just the way that people can understand it. We were having a conversation on our gathering the night before last, and there was a good definition of contextualization, which is, syncretism, is all about making yourself feel good. It's about bending truths to serve yourself or your purposes or an agenda. While contextualization is simply translating the truth, because translating the truth is a difficult process. It's a process that takes time, and I think like that movie Silence is a perfect example because through that line is like is that a lot of ways to learn to be able to be an emissary, to be a message bearer of the Messiah, to be a message bearer of Jesus. We have to learn the ways of the people before, and that can be kind of tricky. It is tricky. I'm not only saying there's tricky. There's also been a lot of ways where things get lost. Things get lost in translation. Hardships happen. I think there's been examples of where it's worked out very, very well, like Ireland, for example.
Hmm.
The people that Saint Patrick. I think that whole story of Patrick is a really good story about, he was someone who was oppressed by the Irish, but, our God sent him back to be an emissary, to be a message bearer of him. And I think that's a very, very powerful sign, and to push back against, the dark, this darkness in people. One of my favorite things, though, just going back onto the subject of just the movie Silence and that metaphor, one of my favorite things about that is that I've learned later, and I've learned from my own research, that the Japanese actually do have a single creator god.
Mm-hmm.
And, the single creator god, is that there's Amaterasu, which is usually like the sun goddess. And there's a lot of things in Japanese mythology which are connected to that. So that's what's referred to in the movie, is that they they missed the point. They just assume you're talking about this, this pre Christian, this pagan,
Mm-hmm.
deity, the deity of the sun. Well, it's interesting is that in the oldest Japanese literature, there's references to Ameno no Minakanushi, and he was the single creator. There was none before him. And an interesting thing, in the Japanese language, his name literally translates to three that are one.
Right.
So the Japanese even had the three, God, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. It's just that the only way that you would have learned about that is learning about the culture, learning about that, to be able to find it. And I think the practical examples of that show its power. But I also think that sometimes, if abstract, it can become you can get lost. You can get lost in the weeds if you're too
Yeah,
abstract.
you can get rather embroiled in the mythology, right? And then you never actually break out of the mythology. It reminds me of some of the earliest kind of, I think, Jesuit missionaries and others to the Middle Kingdom into China, and how the emperor really willingly let them in to China. But when the Jesuits started teaching possibly against like burning incense to the dead, that the emperor, who possibly was Christian at the time, it's really hard to understand if he was or not, ended up just kicking them all out. And that's actually kind of the history of China. And the good news is it's a period of, outside influence, and then it gets to a point where it's not welcome anymore, and then they kick them all out. And however the church in like China still thrives today, because it's now a organic message that is self-contained within China. There's not many outside factors going in.
Right. Yeah, I think one of my best examples of like what is it like, because I really hate long words. Long words, they lose their power. It's like you have to
too abstract.
Yeah, because like contextualization, that's like, okay, that's like 5 syllables. That's a brutal word, for how much is there. I think really just a good example of translating the truth, translating the message, even comes in the book of John. The very beginning of the book of John. And we know that John is very Hebraic. John has a very Hebraic style, but it's also very not philosophical, but it's very wisdom oriented. And the Greeks themselves were a very wisdom oriented people. And I think about the term logos, and there's actually a book written by an Orthodox saint called Christ and the Eternal Tao. And I brought it up because he brought up China, and he brings up the point that logos is a Greek concept. And logos is the Greek concept, which basically means, okay, Cameron is Cameron, Courtland is Courtland. There is matter, but there's something that defines us apart than just what we are like together or apart. We're not just material. There's something that makes chaos, which is another Greek word, into cosmos, order, harmony. There's something that orders that. And the Greeks did not know what it was. They had no idea. Most of their philosophers, we've lost most of the books about it. I believe Heraclitus wrote the most about it, and it does sound like what we would consider to be, divinity. And so as a result, John, he shows goodwill. That's what his name means in Hebrew. He's probably spending a lot of these times with these Greeks and realizing, they don't have a concept. They don't like kings. Greeks don't like kings. That word archon is not a good word. If they say, okay, Yeshua, he's your archon, they would have been very, very suspicious. They would have been like, no, we're not. We don't want another tyrant. And so instead, he says he was the logos made flesh. This was a person. This ordering thing became a person, became a
Mm-hmm.
man, walked among us, and he dwelled with God and was with God, and like, whoa, that's a concept. But in China, they translated that word instead of logos, because what Chinese person has heard of logos?
Yeah.
That's a Greek word that's like there. Instead, they translated it as Tao.
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning was the Tao, and this author makes the claim that Lao Tzu was actually a pre-Christian philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
That when he's talking about the Tao, he's actually talking about what we consider as the God of the Hebrews, the Creator, the one true God, the living God. So I just kind of think that a lot of ways is that it takes a while to find that sweet spot, because when you find the sweet spot, that's when you're actually able to communicate the message in a way that makes sense, in a way that's not bound by mythology, that's not bound by politics, that's not bound by the things that tangle us up, but speak to that deeper. I always think I always think of truth as something that's deeper and not higher, because higher, it seems like it's in the wind, it's fluttering all around up
Well,
there.
yeah, then
But
you get into like Gnosticism or something like that.
yeah, exactly. Just like, I guess we've all seen The Matrix. We've all, there's some great secret that makes your cubicle job meaningless.
No, I really, I think that that's appropriate when we talk about um, contextualization, I suppose. Um, but yeah, at what point do you then sort of, once you understand and you can deeply understand it, at what point do you sort of, and this is of course, I I am a sort of Hebraic thinker. It's really hard to classify what I am today, because it's like I don't really consider myself too much of a Christian. I would consider myself more close to like a, a Nazaire, like what they called the Nazarenes, but I'm not gonna say I'm a Nazarene, because a Nazarene is like a sect today. Uh, just like that original sort of sect of Judaism within Jesus's time is more what I would consider myself today. But I suppose I'm all about people getting saved, and if it's really difficult, and I think Paul in Corinthians really lays it out, like what do you do to like sit down with the Gentiles? Like you kind of eat what's offered to you. To the Jews I'm a Jew, to the Greek I'm a Greek. I suppose my concern, and it's the concern that is, I think, an appropriate one, is what level of obedience do you call people to? And that's essentially
Right.
the end part of Matthew 28. It's, teaching them all that I've commanded you, and
Exactly.
making disciples. And so, whether, I mean, could debate furiously and endlessly about what's the use of uh translating things that might be part of mythology into something that's understandable. But at what point do people sort of get the idea that there is, a set of commands in which to follow? I don't know if I have a question with that, but maybe asking you to
Oh yeah.
respond a bit.
Right, right. Well, I think, like, when I think about that question, because that is the important question right there.
Mm-hmm.
That is the important question, because if not, if you're not teaching all that's commanded, like what it says at the end of it, you're not doing evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
You're missing the point. I think there's definitely, that's usually what happens when people give up. I've noticed in my position, and it might be helpful to like take this from the more the abstract, kind of like we are talking about before, but I think more to the very, it's more personal, just kind of to see how it is. Because, for example, like the Lakota people, my own ethnicity, my own tribe,
Mm-hmm.
that the message has come to my own ethnos, is like, where does my tribe fit into this grand picture? Where does it fit into what the Messiah, what Jesus, what Christ was, desiring? Where does that fit in? And it's like, and it's interesting when you read a lot of the earlier things, a lot of the earlier literature, is that the notion is that if we believe it, it means my people were always waiting for Jesus. My people were always waiting for Creator sets free. We're always waiting for Him. And it's interesting because there's a lot of prophecies which probably speak of it. There's a lot of stories also that probably presage it too. And those stories are always really interesting, because when I think about it now, I think about, that's very clearly divine. Lakotas have a very strong belief in purity, a really, really strong belief in it. Such so strong that if you don't speak it, if you're not careful, you could end up dead. And that sounds very much like, the old or the First Testament. It's just like God is holy.
Well, I mean, it's also the New Testament in some
Oh,
places too.
oh, exactly. Anna and Sapphira. People don't like talking about that story. I love talking about that story because it's like,
It's like the
you know,
same thing, yeah.
right. It's like, so as a result is like, the question is like, how do I obey these commandments, right? Like, how do I come to do these things? How is the way that I should be taught? And I think that's kind of where I myself, and I think also a lot of more newer Lakota Christians, like, I think like the hard part is that we find that what's American is not verdant.
No, it's not.
Kind of like, yeah, the American Christian style is just not a verdant style, and just kind of these things that are just part of it. They just a preacher that I knew that my dad knows, his name's Quincy Goodstar, found Jesus, and he spent a lot of his work doing this contextualization work, and he has a church in Rapid City. I got to meet him just a few weeks ago, but he talked about how if you're not careful, your church almost 90% of your time ends up going into political work. And like, he knows that it's like, there's so many of these people that he knows, like people that are trying to reach natives, people maybe that aren't, it's like ultimately their work is just the political work. They might as well just be a political organizer for whoever they're for, whether they be activists or reactionary as the thing. And he spends a lot of time talking about the nature of grace and just preaching to people, just welcoming people in. And I think he was the one who actually finally broke down, like, what is it like, what parts of my own culture, maybe the ways that we were communicated before, to bring us in line with the tribe that would bless everybody. Because the way that I teach my students is that they ask me, like, what's the point? Why are we listening to what these Jewish people have to say? How does this tribe have any relevance to what we're doing? And Quincy was the one who really outlined this policy when I read his book, and I just adapted and turned it out. It's like, well, let's face it, one tribe was chosen, one tribe was elected, and I'm using the elected to win back some of the reformed people. They were chosen, maybe because they were stubborn, maybe because of this, who knows? But like, he was promised that his tribe would bless all the other tribes. It's like, this tribe was chosen for this very purpose. And when I tell people that, they automatically listen, because they're like, I never heard of it that way before, or they never even heard of it. It says, well, and then this book, I point to a Bible, it's like, is what it's about. It's like, this is the story of our relationship and how we're kind of coming back together. Now, the practical part of coming back together is like, okay, now what do we do with Lakota religion?
Mm-hmm.
Because there's elements of Lakota religion which I think are very, very clearly, pre-Christian, but very, very much fit into what we're doing. But there's
right,
other
and Romans would affirm something like that. People knew the truth at some point. I mean, not like maybe the full revealed thing, but at least some of it. But continue.
At least some of it. And I think one of the ways, just talking personally, again, but it's also like on the high theological level, is that I think it's really interesting, because my job now as a leader and a Lakota person is to help figure and sift out what is like, good, pre-Christian stuff that we adapt, that we basically, all right, this is now what this is about, versus like the other stuff, which is kind of like, like the stuff. So there's a lot of Lakota customs which I'm quite convinced are bad for you and bad for us, but kind of came up, because of like the troubles of the last century. So one is that Lakota people, so one of our things is called the sun dance, and obviously the use of the word sun. But I think one of the things about that ceremony is designed for the expiation of sins.
Mm-hmm.
Is that you would actually go, and the tribe would basically put almost all the sins on like these people who are dancing, and they would get pierced in the chest, and then they would get cut.
Mm-hmm.
And they would either sometimes they'd get a vision out of this, or sometimes they would pray, and like, and that would be basically the expiations of sin from the community. Now, my theory behind that, and Quincy's theory behind that, is that was our original, getting rid of sins ceremony. Like, that was the sacrifice that happened. It was a lot of prayer, a lot of fasting. It's almost like a mix of the sacrifices in the temple and the Day of Atonement. It's kind of mixed in, like, together. But I think there's a lot of people now who just Sundance because they think it's just what we're supposed to do, but they forget what it's about. It's about purging those sins from yourself, but also for the community. You don't just dance because you want to. You dance because you're supposed to be for a community. Like, you're taking on almost that wrath per se,
Mm-hmm.
But Lakota pastor that my dad know, another one, he basically said, well, if you think about it, and you think about the stories we've been, working on, like, just conceptualizing, and he was an older fellow, so he was kind of like an old timer. But he said, he just told my dad this is, if we think about this, what we need to tell people is that Jesus sun danced for the whole world.
Mm.
That's what he was doing. That's what, his death, his, his all of that was about.
Yeah.
And was that it's like, it's no longer we have to like do these things where we have to cut ourselves or be pierced, and just like this. It's not about the aspects of what we can do. In fact, it's what Jesus, it's the ceremony that Jesus did, and what our job now is not just to like, it's not to imitate it, but to accept it. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
we accept that, and that's the gift. That's the gift that we can never earn. And like, oh, that's a different conception right there.
That's absolutely a different conception, because obviously the first iteration of that would be something that would be adherent to Torah, right? It'd be cutting yourself, mutilating yourself
Exactly.
for foreign gods. But if you talk about it in the way that Jesus, of course, and so it's a way to understand it. Now I could see where that's helpful, right? And it has it been helpful for at least people that you talk to sort of understand that Jesus really was able to do that kind of work, that he basically did Sundance for the people?
Right. Well, because it's like, you go back to Isaiah, right? The prophet creator will help us. I love the FNV just because I love knowing what their names mean. I love the fact that Isaiah's name means creator help us.
Mm-hmm.
There's something beautiful about that, like, especially with his message. Because it's like, it's because, the whole thing is like, by his scourging, we are healed. There's something to that. And there's something about, it takes away something that's bad for us, which is that belief that we have to put our own bodies, in the way. We have to suffer ourselves. We have to torture ourselves in order to be healed, in order to be saved. And I don't think it was as bloody in the old days, but these days it can be kind of bloody, especially among some of these folks that are not. And so, like, helpfully, it on a practical level, it's like, I don't want my students, like, obviously cutting themselves or being cut, in that sort of way. I obviously know that that's not necessary anymore. That's the practicality of it. But I think the physical thing about it is like, it's this notion of that, this notion, since we've been separated from God, that this notion that, oh, we almost have to take that story upon ourselves. It's at best, foolish, and it's at worst arrogant. This notion that we can do more than he could do. So a lot of it's like, as I think about it, as just kind of thinking about that, I was talking with a friend of mine, Bobby Gray Eagle, who also does native ministry, and we're just going, what if we just don't no longer have to do the sun dances anymore? Like, that's just not necessary. But what if we change it to a sun, SON, dance? Corny as hell, I know, right? But it's like, but instead, that celebration, that festival, is one of gratitude, is one of thanksgiving, instead of like, this expiation. It still could be like this moment of atonement, and like, that's how we would basically observe a day of atonement, a time of
Right.
atonement is there, instead of trying to import, because I think when you try to import, it's just not our ways. It's like, we have to do things in the way that Lakotas do things, because Lakotas are weird. I'll just say that.
Well, I don't necessarily think, and so I'll disagree with you respectfully on this, but the Day of Atonement is a day which is a feast that's commanded. It's a moed, so it's an appointed time. But the only real command in the moed, aside from, actually, putting the sins of Israel onto goats, and then sacrificing them, it is afflict yourself in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of Jews would, of course, argue today that it means like, fast. So
Mm-hmm.
fast from food and drink. And so it is, of course, a view of afflicting yourself, because it is a time of essentially corporate mourning. It's
Mm-hmm.
about all of Israel being saved at the Day of Atonement. Um, and
Fair enough.
yeah, and the thing is that I of course hold this view of the future that Jesus is going to come back, and when he reclaims the land, he's going to make sacrifice for all of Israel on the Day of Atonement. Um, so yeah, I mean, at what point is it importing, or at what point is it to maybe realize there is actual good truth and applicable truth within the commandments?
Hmm. Well, I think like the other half of that, the other half of like the connection is like what are we missing?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's usually like when you hear about successful missionization, it's usually that's what they're looking for is like we need the second half, which is that we have a pretty good. I would say that Lakotas have a very strong, a very good theology of God, this power of the sacred, the holy. I don't think we need any of that.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely, obviously, need the sun. You know, we need that. You know, we need that. But I think the and even like the spirit, very strong in spiritual matters. But I think what some of the corporeal things we need the stronger connections. You know, with Torah, I would say. One, I think just there's so many we could talk about, but I think one that's the best to talk about is Sabbath.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, it's because we have no recommendation for that. Where there's no connection in the Lakota calendar or the days of the week that correspond with a day of rest, which is explicitly commanded. Everything else seems to be kind of followed through, but the kind of notion of like of adding on these things that we just don't have for our own benefit is necessary. That's where I would think, is because it's after reading Heschel's, Abraham Heschel, has his book on Sabbath, I was quite revolutionized by the thought because there is this notion that it is a great gift that is given to us. And I think to frame it more of as that instead of something to do, instead we think about that the Torah, what if the Torah is a gift?
Oh yeah.
That gift for us. And for me as a Lakota man, like I've accepted that gift and I'm teaching others to accept that gift because that is a gift, that is for us, and it's like for me, like that's one that's very clear right there. That's one that's like, that's something that we need. But it's not like picking and choosing. I think more of it, there's stuff that we already have. There's stuff that we already know. I think the Lakotas all have the first five commandments.
Oh yeah.
First five words. We all have that. That none of that is like needed. The second half of the commandments are the ones that, oh yeah, we kind of need that because there's a strong Lakota culture of stealing. There's like a theft
Mm-hmm.
and maybe even some and then there's even our own traditional ways speak against coveting and stuff like that, but it's almost like we need this to embrace this, and like that will cause wonderful healing and connection, but also just clarity. I really think it is because I think like when I think about native people usually tend to get like this focus like, oh, it's all this darkness,
Mm-hmm.
like Christians in South Dakota are scared crapless by Indians. They're like, they're just like, oh my gosh, there's all these demons, and have these objects that have spiritual things, and it's just like, speaking like that, it sounds like we didn't win. It's from what I've found, but like just praying through and just experiencing it, it's more of a land of confusion, my own people.
Mm-hmm.
There's just confusion. There's confusion and people just don't know. I'd say people are praying, they're imitating the old ways of prayer because they just have no way to like do that. So they automatically think that, oh my gosh, they're praying to these other beings, which according to when you hear from the old people, the really old timers, that was something we never did before. And it's like you see this kind of like, and to use our own terminology, you see this like swishing around of orthodoxy and idolatry, but also vanity and fear.
Mm.
You have the fact that where people are like, for some people feel like they actually have to appease the spirits, which is something that was never done in the old ways. Or then you have people that believe that, oh my gosh, it's this one person, this person has all the answers, and that's vanity, which never would have been allowed in the old days
Right.
as well. And people just assume that like the pipe, that the Lakota are our head religious object. The funny thing about the pipe though is that Quincy, he did a breakdown of it on biblical terms. And, so you think about the pipe, the wood of the pipe has always usually been to describe man. This is not like a religious pipe. This is just a regular just pipe that I bought from a friend who needed food. The wood, is a traditional scriptural image for man. this notion of like, that it is like, but it's mortal, it can be formed, it could be beaten, it can be drawn in, but the pipestone has a connection in the Lakota story of being the traditional blood of the Lakota people, in a very, very long and very good story. But, and the fact is that these notions is what you used to pray for in the old times, and the prayer, it would literally go up, it's almost like how I would say how the altar in the tabernacle is kind of described. It's like that's what this is. But this does not have magical significance. And a lot of people just believe that it has magical significance. It's a rather it's like at very best now it's a symbol. It's just an object. It's like there's more pertinent religious information that needs to be done. There's just ways that we need to follow the Torah better, and to study that and to integrate those into our way, which I think it would actually be fairly, not necessarily easy, but the way would be very apparent.
Absolutely.
So,
And
yeah.
that's something that you don't let it be a sin. If it's a sin to somebody else, you try not let it to be a sin to them. Again, I've really been reading a lot of Corinthians lately, but yeah, Paul would say if it's a sin to your brother in this way, like just don't let it be that sin to him. So don't do it around him in a lot of ways. Um, but you mentioned something that I think is rather appropriate because American Christianity in particular is highly syncretized,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and it's something that you
I
know.
blame the Puritans personally.
Yeah, I mean, we could throw blame around a lot. I try not to really much anymore because, again, you find the strangest bedfellows these days on the same
Oh no, no,
mission.
I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean,
um,
I do enjoy the Puritan style now and again, but
oh yeah, and it's it's really they have a hard time separating American Christianity from the principled truths that are within, like deep embedded within it, because it's almost scary to somebody that would worship God, maybe even not using English, right? Um,
right.
like it'd just be hard for somebody to like go to a Spanish like church, like a church in Spanish. Uh, it would just be really difficult for I think people that are really embroiled in American Christianity to do it. And something you're doing, Courtland, is you're working on the FNV translation, the First Nation version translation of the Bible to Native people groups in America and
Hmm.
Canada, I suppose, too, in the Americas. Sorry.
Yeah,
Um,
America.
and it was really funny because I think there was a conversation we had when you were talking about your writing, but you were also talking about translating for the First Nations version, and you were mentioning to send over those things so that I could review them. And I specifically said I could not do biblical translations. I see things too much in black and white. And you're and that's very true, at least for me. I think those are the giftings that God has given me
Well, I
particularly.
think so. Conviction is quite the gifting.
Yeah, and I see things in black and white, which is why I'm very hesitant around sort of a lot of the multi-ethnic stuff, obviously. But you're working actively on the translations, and you see things. You have to kind of see things in a gray area when you are translating, because there has to be some inherent bias to the translation when you get into it, right?
Right. Well, I mean, we don't even have to bring up the King James Bible, which is like,
The King
kind of
Jacob
its own.
Bible.
Yeah. you
Ugh.
know, um, I think one of the things about it is like one of the things like just about the FNV and just kind of the approach and the style. And one of the things like one of the benefits that I got, because I got to read basically all of the New Testament in like a 6 week period. So I was just reading that. I was like reading like just a general gist commentary, and then just going through and reading it and just absorbing the message. And I've done that before, but I was just kind of thinking about like just figuring this out. And one of the things that became very clear is, and one thing that Terry really believes it, but I think we just shows up. I think it's by the grace of God, by the breath of God, is that it becomes very clear. Have no idea how anyone could become anti-Semitic from the New Testament, because like every time it spends so much time, there's like all in the context. It makes no sense what people say. It's like, oh, he's not doing it. No, Paul is very clearly saying he is Jewish, He very clearly says, these are the ways that I'm supposed to do these things, and I do it. And by God, I have credibility to talk about this. You know, I just love that he always lays down his credibility. He just says, this is like, I have credibility to talk about this. I've studied this. I know this. I know what this is about. So he understands like the middle way. So it's like, what I kind of see about that is I've realized that I'm the other nations that is described in the book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm the other nations. It's like, the Hebrews, they like, they've been given this blessing. They've come to me as message bearers. And me as someone who's accepted this message, my responsibility, my giftings are to make this to my own people understand it. Like that's the challenge for me. And I'm just really, that changes the whole way that you view the New Testament. That's very refreshing, because you're no longer, oh, you're just like a church member, or, oh, you're a religious person. Instead, you're the message bearer
Mm-hmm.
of a great movement of the Creator talking to humanity. You find, like I just said, the strangest bedfellows in the midst of this. And it becomes real, because I think one of my favorite things from the early commentators in the church, Athanasius is a personal favorite of mine. His book on the Incarnation, from obviously from his own style, not from like an original source, because he came like a couple hundred years after the events of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
But he talks about the height of his apologetic argument. The number one argument he uses is that our God listens to us. Our God answers our prayers.
Mm-hmm.
Like the other gods are just painted images,
Yeah.
statues, or stories,
Or demons in some way too.
or demons in some way. Exactly. And I got stories about that too. But but it's like, they're but ours, it's like he just said, ours has brought people back to life. I'm talking about people doing that immediately, like right there. Our God has done this, done this, done this, done this, and I'm like, that is true. And so for me, is like, as I think about the way forward, it's like, it's less about, as I get older, it's kind of like, it's less about spending a lot of time trying to have the correct, quote unquote, systematic theology, or the correct, like, methodology. In reality, it's more of like, I just got to trust in the Holy Spirit, and then just keep telling people about this. And then from that, the connections and everything else will come into line. Those will come to be a part. And not only will I understand it, but the people that I'm reaching to will understand it and will be healed. It's like, it's more than just like me having like pretty words right there. It's about me actually bearing the truth.
Yeah, it's more pragmatic and less ideal, which I mean, I'm all about.
Yeah, exactly. Just practically, and some of my favorite things about it is that it's one of the things about a lot more. Also, the New Testament makes sense too, especially when it talks about like, where does the Torah fit in today? It's like we're reading some of those now. That's a very complicated topic, but it made a lot of sense when I was reading it. It's just like saying, it's not like stepping over a corpse, which I think some people have believed, right? It's like, oh yeah, that thing's gone, it's dead, even though that's the only thing that we context for the new stuff, quote unquote new,
Yeah.
wink. It's just like, so for me it's the same, because it's like, okay, no, like this these Lakota ways, they're not like a corpse for me to step over. What I'm doing is actually, everything is being re-edified, everything's being revitalized, just the just powered up, people are feeling like, that same energy, of the prophets, of the patriarchs, of the, everything that came before. It's like my people are finally meeting Abraham's children,
Mm-hmm.
and like his children are blessing us, and my job is to continue to bless other folks, with that as well.
Well, yeah, and that is the true view of becoming a disciple of Jesus, because you do have to submit to him in every aspect of your life, right? It's again against the American Christianity thing. They're very anti-authority, so I think we don't really, as American Christians, we love our liberty in a lot of ways, but we hate to come under authority.
Oh yeah, people
And
hate it.
I think it's because they want to come under God's authority. But that's
At
what
best.
that was the original, I think, intention behind it, is that they wanted to really be able to be people under God's authority only. But we can't stand man's authority, and we can't stand that maybe perhaps Jesus gave people authority on earth, because he has all the authority. It's mostly everything else comes on lend.
Right. If authority's given, I think like that's one of the things about like I think the gifts that needed people have for like the larger church, the ecclesia, the body of believers, is that we do believe it. All that makes sense. Jesus's lines about being a son
Mm-hmm.
has so much power to me, because it's like, okay, that means I do have authority. I have authority to speak because I'm a son. I'm not just a servant, though I do serve like a servant, in humility, in obedience, but also have the authority of a son. And I just think like those metaphors make a lot more sense to a lot of natives, because we're just closer to that cultural moment. And I wanted to just not to drive the interview, but I just talk about like because you brought up the American church, and I think that's where we get to the crux of the quote, breaking the conventions but keeping the commandments. Because I think the way Chesterton lined that, I don't think he was talking about like necessarily like good religious systems. I think that there's traditions, there's ways like that, and he was very much a traditional believer. I mean, you kind of have to be if you're Catholic, but it's like it's like I don't think that's what he's talking about. I think he was talking about the priggery, the snobbishness, the vanity that comes with when you leave these things to happen. This happens to churches all over the place. This happens that, right? They become like, oh, we got to do this. And it's like it's like things like indulgences or things like Puritan priggery. It's like it's kind of like how like the American church for like a while just completely like revoked sex.
Oh yeah, like you just can't do it. Or even like how the priesthood was described not to do it. When, let's be real, the Old Testament priesthood, the Levitical priesthood, they were married.
Exactly. Yeah. It's like people are just like, wait a minute, what? It's like, and I think that's why it's so in his book about marriage, because it's about that thing about weaving people together. Not by, I think it's just something that God does. I think it's just an expression of his love, is that people just become bonded together in affection. And this weird notion that we have to make rules about these relations.
Well,
it's not necessarily the rules, but extra rules.
Yeah, that is something that I combat all the time, because I'm part of a small group of people that keep Torah, right? This is, I mean, in a large part, what we're talking about, the spirit of religion. It's what overcame the Pharisees. And I actually, while I was doing a little bit of study before this is something that Jesus talks about in the Gospels, because he's continuously coming into contact with the Pharisees, and these people have the religious rule over brother Judah. They have, the Torah is the command of God, but the Pharisees have their own commands. And, even in Isaiah, he's preaching, I'll just read it out loud. Then Adonai said, because the people approach me with empty words and they honor me, they bestow on me mere lip service, while in fact they have distanced their hearts from me. That their fear of me is just a mitzvah, that is a command of human origin. That people, and this stems from the garden, right? When the woman is talking to the serpent, and she says, the serpent says, like, why can't you eat the fruit? And she says, oh, we were told not even to touch the tree. Right. And the thing is that it doesn't say there, Abba never said don't touch the tree. He said don't eat the fruit of the tree. So already we're talking about people putting up little tiny fences around the original word, and then holding those fences as the word of God. And that is the spirit of the Pharisees. That's the spirit of religion in a lot of ways, which I think Yeshua is saying, just worship me in spirit and truth. You have to really, and of course I'll say that means follow the commands of God and not the commands of men. That is breaking the convention and keeping the commandments, because really you have to just hold God's law as the standard. And it's really the only standard, because, and since Jesus of course butted heads with the Pharisees all the time, he's butting heads with their own interpreted religion. And within, contextualization is people will start to hold the traditions of men higher than the commands of God. And it's a hard system to butt against because it becomes the word of God to people, right?
Exactly.
These systems of men will become, because they're so rigid and they're not flexible. And I think it's very important to be flexible in your thinking and flexible in just how you understand things. And that is a view of humility. It's against the vain concepts which you were talking about earlier, where people are very vain and thinking that they're right all the time.
Exactly. The vanity is also just a symptom of cowardice. It takes courage to be humble. It takes courage to be humble. It also takes courage to love. And I think one of the best examples that I have, especially these days, is I got to see Sitting Bull's crucifix, that the Jesuits gifted him back in 1887 or so. Red Cloud himself also became a Christian. All the old timer generations, they became it. Now it's just a shame that the successors bungled it, but what can you do? It's like, but the thing about it is that the old timers had no problem because they also accepted truth. They realized that this made sense. That the creator walking among us, this story makes sense, and that's what we have to figure out. There's a great book about Black Elk. Who a lot of people, they read his book and they say, "Oh, this is an example of what Indianness is supposed to be before Christianity came and messed it up." They're like, they always use this example, but when I read that book, you see a lot of implications. You see a lot of connections to the story. It's like, and you see a lot of the Torah viewed through like a glass almost. Just through the sands and the mist of time. Because one of the things about it is that Black Elk very fully came completely on board, and one of his best stories, it's kind of strange because he was a heyoka, which was a kind of a traditional clown. So when you read his words, he's obviously kind of telling a joke. And the story he tells, he says, when I was like, I would still keep going and I'd pray in the ways of the old ways. And then the priest came and saw me doing this one time, and he came up, he picked me up by the lapels and slapped the crap out of me. This quote is actually not far from like what he actually said. Just keeps hitting me until I stopped doing it, and then I did, and I was grateful for it. Now, did that literally happen? Probably not. This man was huge, and but he was talking about it in the metaphorical way. He was talking about it as the priest was telling him the truth, and was encouraging him, and was pushing him, and was encouraging him like for a level of excellence.
Yeah, like a rebuke, a really strong one.
Exactly. Now, how strong it was, we don't know, but to Black Elk, it must have been very strong. As he talks about in this metaphorical way. And for me, it's like he's obeying all the commandments of the Lakota people. The commandments to live, to be brave, to be compassionate, to be wise, and to be generous. Like those are the things that define what being Lakota is. Probably because those things are things that we can usually be pretty bad at. We can be quite greedy. We can be quite cowardly and bloody. We can be quite blind. For sure. But it's like, no, Black Elk right there, by his embracement of Jesus is like, that's breaking the conventions right there. That's breaking the conventions. Those are things that were made by people. Breaking that, but keeping the commandments.
Yes, positively. You mentioned something in there where people, and I think a lot of people still view it this way, that sort of Christianity is a tool of Western imperialism. That's as much as the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, would say. And a lot of people over the world, and I don't know if I mentioned this on a podcast that didn't get recorded, but like I used to study anthropology, and they I was an archaeologist for about 1 year before I got my degree in filmmaking. And the thing is that anthropologists cannot stand Christians because they quote unquote destroy culture, right? And I'll have to kind of sort of agree with them in some aspect, because they're calling people in a lot of ways. When you start to follow God, you're called away from the culture. But what you're saying is that that in a lot of ways it's about tying what it is to the greater truth, and
Right.
this sort of revealed things. And when it comes into it, like let's say the Tongan, I think it's actually like Polynesian peoples. This was a case study where pre-Christianity, like the teenagers didn't have any pimples on their face, but then after all these missionaries came and introduced Christianity, then all the people had pimples on their face because their raging hormones couldn't be they couldn't be men anymore, so they developed pimply faces, right? And sort of saying like one was a better way than the other. And it's a hard line to draw, right? You have to say when do you of course accept some of the things that are just merely cultural, and I'll cede a lot of ground in things like language and things like what's an easy way to understand, what is a form of musical worship, right? And I mean, music is as diverse as people are, right? And it's mostly because what's the instruments and the things that have come about from that local area that can be useful and gratifying to the Lord in worship. And of course, these things are all ways. I mean, but then of course I'll take a strong stance of like what's the day of God and like when is the Sabbath. And it's really funny because like in our varsity, Courtland, it's like where we hyper contextualize and then decontextualize some things, and it's really funny because it's
Right.
like a couple of years ago we were told like we really got to start keeping Sabbath, and so they like hyper say like, okay, we got to keep the commandments in one way, and then they decontextualize keeping the commandments to like sort of hyper hand wavy spiritualize it, like, oh, just any day of the week, just take 4 hours off or something like that. And it gets a little bit muddy when you have to try and reinterpret the commandments,
Right.
instead of just keep them, right? Just keep the commandments in some way or another, because I mean, not in some way or another. I think it's really clear and it's not confusing.
Yeah, I think some of that, just to bounce right on that, I think some of that is just like, humans, like we invented marketing,
Uh-huh.
It's like, we want things, to be appealing, and I think that can be an instinct that, can be good, but I think
Mhm.
sometimes when it's not good, it's not necessarily evil, but it's just annoying. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of kind of like the strong things of the heart, and you could find that all the time. I mean but it's like it's not just us. I mean, the Lakota people do the same thing. I mean, if I have to hear, it's amazing. Native social media is like the best and the worst in the entire world because it's filled with that.
Mhm.
It's either like everything's either like a perpetual crisis about some obscure legal thing. I'm not saying it's not important. It's just that the art of hyperbole and
Mhm.
just getting washed away in that whole morass of just it's just. But I think that's just the thing about people. It's just a dumb thing that people do, and we grow out of it.
Hopefully.
I, I think but it's just, I think it just expresses, humans can be kind of frivolous, uh, you know, just frivolous about stuff. And I think that the key is like, it goes back to the quote, figuring out what is the commandment, and it's not a sin to make a joke, but it's like, it's more of like, actually living
Mhm.
your religion, more than it just being like something that you do, but
Or
something
being
that
or being pushed each way to the wind, right?
exactly being pushed this way, that way, gosh, it must. Gosh, I just hate going to church services these days, especially where they have like a projection on the background.
Uh-huh.
That's my rule there. Just because one, the sermons are too long. Um, you know, It's like 15 minutes is pushing it for a sermon, and like everyone thinks, oh, we got to have like 45 minutes to talk about this, and it's like, okay, like,
I'll admit
just
I'm pretty guilty of that too, but I mostly teach, so.
yeah. It's like, for me, it's just kind of like, I think that's probably where my gifting goes. Like, okay, but where are we connecting? Where are we connecting to all those, our brothers and sisters across the world? That's a modern thing, but in the ultimate traditional way, how are we connecting to our folks, to our people? It's like the people that we are now a part of. How, are we saying any of the old prayers? Are we saying any of the old songs? In this more than just beyond our own nation, but before. And I'm just kind of thinking how wonderful it'd be. And I'm pretty wide open on this. I mean, I think it's, I was like, obviously I would desire more worship in Hebrew. That's a beautiful thing. But I'm also open to more worship in Latin too.
Yeah. I mean,
I know that like both of those are sticking points to two different people, but
I mean, I'm not going to really argue much for singing songs in Hebrew too much. I mean, I know some people that I'm pretty close to are, but I'm more interested in people becoming a holy people, being set apart in some way.
Being the set apart, and that is following the way,
Yeah, and that is, of course, when you're going to run into the barriers, is when you have to somehow cross the cultural line. You have to go and meet people in a lot of ways where they're at, because where they're at is going to be in a way that is, against God.
Oh yeah.
But
totally.
then you have to bring them into discipleship to follow God, right? And to follow.
It's almost like it's the story of Jesus, but it's also even in the Exodus story. The notion of, oh yes, the people are set free, but they don't stay in Egypt.
Yeah, you have to. Yeah, you're purchased at Passover with the blood of the lamb, but at Shavuot, Torah was given to a saved people. So, and at Pentecost, as it's the New Testament Shavuot. It's just it's the same thing. At the same thing that all these people are speaking in different languages. All these Jews coming into Jerusalem for Shavuot, they all have different languages. They're all across the globe. It's a commandment to come into Jerusalem to give your offering at Shavuot, to wave your grain offering there. But it's and that is the view, is that it's all these people now have different languages, and they're able to go back to their people and talk about it. But it's still a commandment given to a saved people, right?
Exactly.
So we've talked about an hour, Courtland. So I think we should probably end it here. Any last thoughts or words you want to say?
I would definitely recommend, Man Alive by G.K. Chesterton, just because I think one of my favorite things about that book is that he was shipping before it was cool.
Like romantic shipping?
Yeah, and he tells you how to do it right.
Okay.
He tells you how to do it right. I'm just going to tease it like that because that's the right way to go. I mean, that itself is also a whole other conversation. Just the modern phenomenons of the internet. Where it reflects and all that. But I would recommend that book because it's like it's a good one. I might pick it up again myself. But like I said, just to wrap up the thoughts, I think we got really to the heart of the matter. It's like. Mm-hmm. We are message bearers and we're leading people out.
Absolutely.
We're open, but we're open to leading people out, leading people, to be the people set apart, to be the people saved.
Right on. Well, thank you for joining, Courtland, and thank you guys for listening. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. This is something that I just kind of do on my free time, and it's important conversations within the evangelical world that I think we need to have. Particularly in these days when people are just being pushed each way to the wind by whatever the prevailing voice is. So if this conversation was helpful to you, I would recommend that you share it with your friends. But thank you again, Courtland, for coming on, and I hope you all have a blessed day, and shalom.